Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with me here this morning, or whatever time it is where you are in the world. I have about 11:01, so we'll give folks about one more minute before we get started. If you have any questions for me in advance, you can pop those in the chat. Otherwise, we'll also leave room for questions at the end. I have muted everyone, but you will be able to unmute yourself towards the end for any questions or comments. All right. So this is now our third installation of this season's Jedi Speaker Series. Again, Jedi stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. My name is August Ball, and I'll be introducing myself more formally in just a moment for those of you who might not be familiar with me. And while we're all getting logged in, if everyone could just type into the chat where you're currently joining from and what organization you're with, if you're with an organization. All right. Well, friends, let's go right ahead and get into it. So this session is going to be called Equity in the Environmental Field, Why Collective Diversity and Representation is Not Enough, and What We Can Do About It. Again, hello, my name is August Ball. I am the founder and CEO of Cream City Conservation and Consulting. I want to give a little bit of background about myself. Some folks know my story of how I started C4. Others don't. If you're new here, this will be just some grounding rather, information for you. I was born in Wisconsin. I'm currently in Wisconsin right now on the ancestral lands of the Menominee, Potawatomi, and Oneida people. And I was born to a Black Jewish father and a Swiss German and Greek mother. And my first experience with just the unconscious bias that can come about with humanity actually started at a very young age. When I would tell people that my father was Jewish, and then they would meet my dad and be surprised that my dad was Black. And it kind of highlighted for me and my sister just the assumptions that we have about identity. My mom passed away when I was 3 years old, and a few years later, my dad remarried a Filipina. A Filipina, in fact, who was also part Chinese. And so my family ended up moving to Southeast Asia. So I spent most of my formative years in Cebu, in the Philippines, with my step family until I was about 19 years old. So this experience of growing up in not only a multi-ethnic, interfaith, and multilingual family really laid the foundation for not only how I see the world as it is, but also what I believe is possible. Um, I oftentimes joke about being a cashew because my stepmom is Catholic, but that's a joke for another time. So this is a photo of me and my one of my first kind of dream jobs. I had a lot of experiences working in education, working in the outdoors, but I will say working for a conservation corps was by far my favorite because I got to apply a lot of the things I had experienced growing up on a farm in the Philippines to my work of connecting young people to public lands, as well as caring for that land. Um, this was a job where I got to both, cultivate leaders, but also got to get my hands dirty as well, working on various projects throughout Milwaukee County. So it was not uncommon that one day I might be in a suit, the next day I might be in work boots. And I loved being able to foster the next generation of leaders, especially for young women of varying identities. Unfortunately, though, like with most nonprofits, funding ebbs and flows. And in 2016, the program that I was running in Wisconsin lost its funding. The funder decided to go in a different direction. And so this photo here is known as the photo of the last blue shirts. I went on to work for the Milwaukee County Parks Department, bringing with me some students that had been in my program for the past few years, and even attempting to cultivate a crew, a conservation crew within the Parks Department. But again, because our public lands are so um, significantly underfunded. The only way to do that was to utilize my consulting work for other environmental organizations and then funnel that into paying the students for their work within that institution. I became a little bit frustrated with the lack of diversity and representation. So often I would hear from folks that, oh, well, folks of color just aren't interested in this career track, or no one's applying. And I just knew that that wasn't true. I knew that quite a bit of this was connected to the way that these positions were being presented, where they were being presented, and the internal culture that existed within the environmental sector uh, that was causing the disparate representation. And so I decided to formalize Cream City Conservation rather than it just be a passion project. And I'm going to talk to you all today about some things I've learned over the years, what organizations are doing that are producing success, and what organizations are doing that are keeping them stuck. So, as I mentioned, in 2016, in October, I founded Cream City Conservation and Consulting, and then also created Cream City Conservation Corps. In December of 2020, we became a certified B Corp, which means that we are a part of a global movement that essentially follows a set of guidelines that helps us be inclusive, equitable, and regenerative. Um, these corporations exist all across the US and Canada, but also connect to entrepreneurs and different businesses globally. Essentially, it is a way to use business as a force for good that does not involve reliance on philanthropy directly. Although I will say our organization we are still tied to philanthropy because our clients oftentimes are nonprofits themselves who write grants to be able to work with us. So we are not completely independent of charitable contributions just yet, but that is our goal, is to be 100% independent of charity over the next few years. So the mission at C4 is essentially to inspire people who inspire people to live socially and environmentally just. And our mission is intentionally designed this way because right now, how we do that is by cultivating the next generation of environmental leaders and simultaneously preparing the existing industry to be ready for this new generation of environmentalists. Now, how we get to this mission in another 10 years may look different, but our mission will not change. How we do that work may. So right now, we are utilizing education, workshops, and coaching to environmental organizations, and using that to fund our conservation corps, which I'll talk about towards the end. But first, I want to talk about where we currently are as far as the industry is concerned. Right now, people of color represent a significant disproportionate or lower level of board members in various organizations, especially conservation and preservation organizations. While we have 22.5% of interns of color, we have less than 5% of board members on environmental organizations identifying as people of color. This is not at all representative of our US labor force or population. And it's quite concerning considering that our demographics here in the United States are changing year by year. In fact, children under the age of 16, over 50% of them identify as people of color and are people of color. So we can only imagine what this is going to look like in 2040. And in addition to the representation of folks of color, I also want to highlight that the assumption, the myth that people of color are not interested in the environment is also a fallacy that keeps us stuck. If we don't believe that a group of people are interested in a topic or in a career track, we're certainly not going to seek them out and hire them and create programs that are relevant to them. So just looking at how voters of color stack up against white voters, again, 60% of voters of color in comparison to 46% of white voters vote in accordance with their concerns for pollution of rivers, lakes, and streams. Climate change, 57% in comparison to 39% of white voters. Toxins and pesticides in our food and drinking water, 60% of voters of color vote in favor of policies that protect against these issues. Pollutions of our oceans, again, 52% of voters of color in comparison to 39% of white voters. Loss of habitat for fish and wildlife, 51% of voters of color vote in accordance with protection for these matters as well as care about these matters in comparison to 35% of white voters. And loss of natural areas, again, 54% of voters of color, rather, in comparison to 32% of white voters. So the more we can really right size some of the and correct some of these misconceptions about folks of color and their interest and concern for the environment, the better off we will be positioned to reevaluate what we are actually doing and taking ownership for what we as an industry are doing to be more attractive to a labor force that is ever growing. In addition to this, in terms of who is impacted by environmental degradation, we also see a significant disparity there. 71% of Black Americans are breathing polluted air. 50% of Latine community members are breathing polluted air, and 34% of whites are breathing polluted air. When it comes to overall pollution exposure versus pollution creation, 56% of Black Americans are experiencing more pollution than they cause. For Latine community members, they are experiencing 63% more pollution than they cause. And whites are experiencing 17% less pollution than they cause. I want to let that sink in for a moment. Right? Now, a lot of this is connected to legalized segregation policies and practices, as well as different socioeconomic factors, which are all solvable, right? Because these are problems that have been created by people. And so us as people can solve them. So why do most organizations still fail if to represent, to acquire and attract a labor force that is representative of the population of workers available? Well, number one, there's a failure to recognize and communicate that diversity is frankly good for business. Leaders have oftentimes failed to communicate how its workforce is linked to company success and in fulfilling its mission. Leaders themselves often don't recognize how critical a diverse and equitable workforce is in the success of their company. And leaders have failed to establish trust, make amends for past harm, and now staff are distrustful of their intentions. In addition to this, oftentimes organizations think that one person or a department is responsible for workforce diversity. So, for example, you may have hired a chief diversity officer or started a DEI committee or taken your team through a one-off workshop on diversity, and now you think the problem is solved. Or worse, you think you're done. Right? The individuals who are groups that are leading the charge don't have teeth, right? They don't have the organizational power to hold the institution or the organization accountable for change. There's no benchmark that has been set. There's no intersectional analysis of the organization, of its staff, of its culture that has not been established. No one is actually measuring or tracking diversity metrics. The wrong metrics are being tracked. And lastly, but I would say most importantly, you haven't cleaned house. So many organizations think that if they just bring in a person of color, for a person with a marginalized identity, that will automatically cure all that ails them. But the company hasn't rid itself of its own unconscious bias in hiring, in recruitment, and in its overall culture. There's no retention plan for any staff, let alone staff with marginalized identities. Leadership has not addressed the fear of change head on. Oftentimes, leaders end up attempting to protect the feelings, right, of those who actually experience the most privilege in the organization, which also could keep them stuck. Leaders themselves aren't taking accountability, right? They might hire someone to come in and do education sessions for their staff, but they themselves are not participating. And consequently, they end up becoming the problem. Now, does this mean that um, when organizations are not making advancements in equity and in representation in their organizations, that they just don't care or they're blatantly against diversifying their workforce? No. But what is stopping us is that most organizations simply don't know where to start. Those of you who've worked with me in the past may know that I don't believe in procrastination. Don't think it exists. Um, Typically, when someone is quote unquote procrastinating, it is because they don't know what the next step is. And I see that same reality show up in organizations. When we don't know what to do, we simply don't act, we freeze. And that in of itself is an action, but one that's not going to direct us in the areas where we want to be working. There isn't knowledge of how to get everyone on the same page, right? You might have a few personally passionate individuals who want to drive the work, who have foundational language and understanding of the source of problems, but there isn't consistency across the board. Back in 2021, I want to say, we started a program to help establish foundational language for people, not just organizations. And we hosted some free workshops during that time. And one of the key examples that led to that work was realizing that so many community members were using terms like racism and racial prejudice interchangeably when they were not the same thing. And so my team and I realized that, gosh, if we aren't even speaking the same language, how are we ever, and have a shared understanding of what the problem is, how are we ever going to solve this? So we have to start first by making sure that we have shared language. The next is that even once education has been unfolded, organizations don't know how to take that learning and implement it into actionable steps. So with our organization, which is a social enterprise and certified E Corp, we have founded over the past couple of years the JEDI cohort program, which again stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. This program basically allows for organizations to assess their organizational culture, to have all of their staff and board members complete foundational and advanced level workshops to establish shared language, and they leave our care with a DEI strategy, or also known as a roadmap. The goals of this assessment are to give each organization a baseline of where they are culturally, to bring clarity to a set of complex data that is intersectional, and to identify demographic related disparities in experiences. Most organizations, when they conduct surveys of their staff, it's very one-dimensional. They either want to know how many of who do they have on team, or they just want to know collectively how are people experiencing the organization. And the reality is our identities are not neutral. They're not formed in a neutral environment. We don't experience the world neutrally as it relates to our identity. And so being able to evaluate your data, your culture intersectionally can help folks identify whether there's disparities for folks based on identity. So some of the factors that we assess are belonging, fairness, opportunities and resources, right? Sense of voice. And we compare that against identity, against gender, race, age, tenure, caregiver status, education status, physical abilities, etc. We also incorporate custom demographics, rank and role, job level, multilingual skills, location. This allows us to be able to pinpoint where you have the most opportunity for improvement and where you're already thriving. An example of this intersectional assessment is here. So you can see on the left-hand side that POC women or women of color are having a very different experience in this particular organization in comparison to white men. On the right-hand side, you can see that ability women or women who have a disability are having a very different experience in the same organization in comparison to men who are enabled or men who do not have a disability. This allows for an organization to narrow in on how they're going to address these disparities, because a rising tide does lift all ships, and oppression operates very similarly. Is it the isms of our society operate very similarly? And so, if you can solve for the group that is experiencing the most disparity, you're more likely to foster a more inclusive organization overall. We also look at these different factors based on a set of questions that are connected to those factors. Sorry, yes. And we also protect identity by having a minimum sample size. So, for example, here we have some folks who may be identified as non-binary. Because we didn't meet our minimum sample size, we won't get to see their responses independently so that we don't out certain individuals. But it still allows us to capture their insight in the overall percentages. We also are able to collect more qualitative data by looking at the comments that responders provide to the assessment. So one example that I like to share of how this has been useful for our company in the past is when we had an organization conduct an assessment, and the majority of their staff answered no to the question of, do you see yourself working with this organization over the next 2 years? Which on its head would seem that this organization had a retention problem. When we looked at the comments connected to that question, what we found was that the majority of responders stated that they were going to be retiring in the next year to 2 years. And so it wasn't that they had a retention problem, they had a succession problem. With our platform, we are also able to evaluate all of the comments that responders provide, again, to give us a more qualitative and inclusive framework of where the organization is. We can see how many comments were favorable, critical, or neutral. We can see how many responders commented per question or per individual. And then it allows us to then also see high level view of which comments received the more positive statements and which topics received more critical responses or comments. So diversity is the result of inclusive and equitable culture. We might think that, if we build it, they will come, right? If we simply throw a bunch of folks of different identities in the mix, that will automatically sort itself out. And in reality, what that actually does is set people up for harm. And so it's critical that an organization, quite frankly, even before they begin inviting folks into their organization, really evaluate, is my organization a safe place for people with marginalized identities? What protections do we have in place for example, an individual with a marginalized identity who might have a difference of opinion, who might offer some constructive dissent to the direction that you're going to go? So often organizations will say that they want diversity so that they can make better decisions, so that they can have a broader spectrum of information to make decisions from. And yet, when they have an individual on their team, for example, who has a disability and is open about that, is a person of color, is a woman, is a someone who's LGBTQ, or someone who's non-binary, when that person actually brings their identity into the fold and shares their perspective based on their experiences, so often, unfortunately, what happens is that that person is treated as a problem. They're treated as someone who is pointing out negativity rather than actually taking that insight and considering that. And so it inadvertently sends the message that we just want to look like we are being inclusive, or faux elaboration, if you will. And that in of itself can not only be harmful to the individual with a marginalized identity, but it can also be harmful to other members on your team. So how we work to address some of this is through our comprehensive workshops. We start off with establishing leadership skills, understanding effective communication and leadership strategy, helping folks identify and interrogate their socialization around leadership, how to utilize effective conflict management models. I often say that conflict cannot always be managed. Sorry, it can be resolved, but it can always be managed. And also, conflict is not bad. If you have a team that never disagrees on anything, you have a huge problem because that says either one of two things. Either you have a team that is completely gridlocked, that is completely in lockstep with one another, or you have a team that is afraid to go against the grain. Either way, you're in deep trouble. The next is Introduction to Racial Equity. This is where we lay the groundwork for understanding the historical construction of race and the various policies and practices that have produced the inequitable outcomes that we're tackling today. We then move on to Foundations of Internalized Racism, both internalized racial superiority and internalized racial oppression. In this workshop, participants get to practice being in affinity spaces. They get to articulate the basic definitions of privilege and oppression, allyship and co-conspiratorship, as well as evaluate how we may, even for folks of color, how we might be lifting and holding up some really problematic practices in society. The next is Disrupting White Dominant Culture. This workshop helps us understand the definition of white dominant culture and white fragility, helps us recognize racial battle fatigue, and be able to articulate practices and cultures that mitigate trauma and foster a thriving workplace. Social identities and intersectionality in the workplace allow for us to evaluate how our own identities are intersectional and how we can understand that there's an aggregate impact when different identities are combined. In recruitment and hiring and retention, we debunk some of the commonly held myths that are keeping talent acquisition and retention at levels that are not desirable. We help you evaluate sample job descriptions and create a more inclusive and equitable practice around your recruitment and hiring strategy. These practices also work if you are focused more on board membership, recruitment and retention, as well as volunteers and participants in your programs. Participants also leave this workshop with a toolkit for cultivating inclusive culture. And lastly, we provide a set of equity tools for participants. The Spectrum of Safety, which is an online decision-making tool, an equity framework to help evaluate your decisions, a toolkit for mapping proximity to white dominant culture, and interview rubrics, and many more. So essentially, throughout the cohort, participants leave with a framework or a strategy to promote equity, looking at how you are attracting talent, selecting talent, developing talent, and retaining that talent. One of the ways that we keep folks on track is by having them create their own internal work plan. This is both internal and living, which means that whenever someone is onboarded into your organization, they have access to this work plan so that they know where you started from, what you're working on, who's working on what, and it keeps your organization on track to meet your goals. The additional purpose of this is so that once my team is gone, your organization has a toolkit that you can update annually based on what you've accomplished. We also help organizations create an external facing roadmap. This is a summary of where your organization is and what your goals are. This is a great tool to be able to share with funders, share with community partners, as well as individuals who are considering employment at your organization or board service. Now, I want to share a case study about this work. So I'm going to give an example of a one-year post-program organization. So this organization started working with me in, I want to say 2022. And this is their roadmap. I'm going to just kind of quickly go over it. But I want to highlight some of the key changes that this organization made and what that produced for them. Number one is they evaluated and edited their position descriptions with an equity lens. They made sure that they had clear criteria. They listed pay rate and pay range for all positions, and they made sure that contribution to workplace culture was seen as a job function. This meant that diversity was not the sole job of one personally passionate HR representative. This was everyone's responsibility, and that was communicated consistently. Next, they made their data public. Even though their data maybe wasn't what they wanted it to be upfront, they were honest about that. And they used that as their commitment to diversifying their staff. They also identified and remediated any of the inequitable workplace practices that were brought to light throughout the cohort experience. Next, they increase their transparency in decision making. Um, Quite often, organization leaders think that they are doing their team members a favor by not being transparent on how decisions are being made. And that sets us up for not only unconscious bias, but to quite frankly, make decisions that aren't the best because it's impossible for a handful of leaders to know what's going on with every corner of the organization. And so being able to involve everyone who's going to be impacted by the decision in the decision making process not only helps for better decision making the first time around, but also ensures that nothing is missed. Now, raise your hand, friends, if you've ever worked for an organization where you've experienced within a fairly short period of time multiple reorgs. I just want to see for a moment who has experienced that. Raise your hand if you've experienced multiple reorgs. Yeah. So thank you. That is a clear indicator that that your organization did not get the right people on the team of the decision-making process. If an organization is going through multiple reorgs, that means that they made decisions, probably in a vacuum, that they did not know. That also had impact that they didn't consider because they didn't have those who were going to be impacted by the decision in that process. Next, they train staff to replicate the desired culture with professional development series, whether that was recorded JEDI workshops that each staff was required to complete within a particular time set, or joining our live workshop series. So here's what happened. Within the first year, we saw an increase of diversity by 19%, an increase of sense of voice by 5%, an increase in perceived equity by 6%. Now, not only this, we also saw an increase of representation by 14% with this staff who had a disability. We saw a 5% increase of staff who identified as caregivers. So these are staff who are giving care for someone other than their child. We saw a 7% increase of staff of color. We saw a 9% increase in LGBTQIA staff members. We saw a 6% increase of gender identity. Again, more across the board. And then we saw a 7% increase of individuals where English was not their native language. We saw a 3% increase in representation of folks with varying education levels. Again, so some who were either had some university schooling or some bachelor degrees, et cetera, that increased overall. But I also want to show the experiences of these folks, right? Because it's one thing to increase representation, but that representation isn't that helpful if folks are having a negative experience within your four walls, be they virtual or physical. So I just want to highlight here, look at this inclusion number from 2022. Staff who identified as LGBTQ stated that their sense of inclusion was at about 60%. But look at what happened just a year later. 90% felt included at their organization. But also look at staff who are not LGBTQIA. They also increased by 10%. Sense of voice was at 50% coming into the program and left at 81%. These are huge numbers, by the way, in terms of like a shift. And this didn't happen by accident. The next, caregiver status. We see initially caregivers were perceived the sense of diversity at 47%. A year later, they perceived it at 79%. And again, look at the experiences of folks who were not caregivers, moving from 65 to 81%. Education. Staff who did not have hold at least a bachelor's degree had a very different experience, right? Which, you know, our formal education is very much so directly linked to social class, among other things. But look at 2023 as the organization began to make changes in how they value all ways of knowing. And then look at the sense of equity, 33% to 83%. Now, I'm going to continue sharing some examples, but I want to be clear. All I can give clients is information. All my team and I can do is provide information. It is up to organizations to implement that learning, to take action. So Family status. Those who were single parents, their sense of equity was at 56% in 2022. In 2023, that increased to 80%. Their sense of growth, right? 63% in 2022. A year later, 82%. Race and ethnicity. So we had, for the experiences of Black staff, African American staff, their sense of inclusion was at 69%. The following year, it was at 94%. Gender identity. We'll point out here, women, their sense of inclusion was at 69% in 2022. In 2023, it was at 91%. Now, here's where I want to point out. As you begin to implement more equitable practices, those who have been benefiting from the exclusion of others might feel threatened. So you'll note here that for men, their sense of growth and leadership in 2022 was 76% and 90% respectively. The following year, it was at 70 and 76%. I truly believe that this is a key area that organizational leaders have to be prepared for. You have to be prepared that those who have been benefiting from the oppression and the exclusion of others, once you begin to implement inclusive and equitable practices, they can feel threatened. And so keeping these individuals, these groups of people involved in the process is mission critical to them not derailing your efforts. And I will say, derailment is not always conscious. Oftentimes it's unconscious, right? Which is why maintaining a shared level of understanding and language around why you're doing what you're doing is so critical. So how do you sustain these efforts? Well, you ensure that designated staff are assigned to each action item in your roadmap, right, or in your plan. You make Jedi work a standing agenda item. There is no reason why this work should fall through the cracks. You treat your equity efforts like business bills, right? Like your mandatory reporting. And here's what I mean by that. We don't not pay our bills in an organization, in a business, or file our key reports to funders or to the government because we got too busy with work, right? We recognize that that is the work. And so if that is happening, it means that we're still not looking at this work as mission critical to the success of your organization. We know this work is valuable and that these plans, these structures work because it's the same process that we use in our own organization with our social impact model. And in fact, it is what has earned us B Corp's Best for the World designation in 2022 in the worker category. So B Corp assesses members, organizations and companies annually. And what they have a set of guidelines that you have to meet in order to maintain your B Corp status, but also a set of assessments. It's called the B Impact Assessment. You can actually go on it today, even if you're not a B Corp, and see how you stack up against traditional business versus social entrepreneurship. Anyways, we won the Best for the World designation in 2022 for our company size. We were one of a few other organizations, and we're really proud of that. But to me, this again, it's proof essentially that this isn't just stuff that's made up. Like we know that we have data-backed confirmation that this process does work. And we use the profits, again, from this work of helping other environmental organizations shift their culture, implement more equitable practices. We use those same funds to fund our hands-on service to public lands through our conservation corps, through our green infrastructure corps, through our urban agriculture crews, and through our civic advocacy. So again, thank you so much for being with me here today, friends. If you would like to learn how your organization can be a part of our next Jedi cohort, we start in January. Just go to our website that's here on the screen. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen to take any questions that you might have. But again, thank you so much. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself or pop them into the chat. Or you can send them to me privately as well if you don't want to put your question live on the in the chat. All right. Well, while we're waiting for any questions, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll just to see a two-question poll, just to see if anyone learned anything new today, and if you think you'll use what you've learned today in your work or personal life over the next 3 months. Oh, wonderful. Lovely, lovely. Okay, so we've got one question, friends. Someone has asked, can you speak a little more about the unconscious derailing that can happen? Absolutely. So, for example, our brains, as magnificent as are they don't often do a very good job at deciphering the difference between when we are embarrassed and when we are simply when we are under threat. Sorry. So, an example of this can be um, being resistant to taking leadership from people of color, from women, for example. And actually, I can think of a better example. So, this is a real example, which is it happened quite a few years ago, but it still sticks with me. Um, Two staff of an organization, both in leadership positions, an older white male gentleman and a middle-aged black woman, both executive leaders. And every time the black woman would give an idea or a suggestion, the white male leader would say, "Huh, that's actually a good idea." Every time, he would always say, "Huh, that's actually a good idea." And it got to the point where, as I would sit in on these meetings to observe, this was prior to COVID, and I would sit in on meetings to observe company culture directly. And I pulled him aside and I said, do you realize how often you say actually when you and only when you are responding to person X's ideas and suggestions? And he immediately turned bright red and said, I didn't even realize I was doing that. I was like, yeah. And do you notice that I've never heard you say that when a man of color or a white man, was giving a counter insight or giving a suggestion. Um, and instead of that person recognizing that as, oh, wow, like my unconscious bias was totally just coming out there, I am a product of my environment. We're all swimming in this water. He instead made it his business to try to point out whenever he felt that his black female colleague was wrong, because he couldn't accept that his unconscious bias had been showing up over the past few months, at least that I could observe. And so it created such a negative environment for this Black female executive that she ended up leaving. And in response to that, his perspective was, well, she just wasn't a good culture fit. So, that's some of I guess, an example of, an unconscious derailment of efforts. Um, Another example could be, um, the unconscious bias around even hiring someone who is different, right? In the organization isn't currently represented. The assumption, for example, that um, let's say it's a land trust organization and they have volunteers and are very dependent on volunteers. And when it comes time to hire for a position, uh, it is favored that those who had been volunteering should get priority for that position rather than someone applying off the street. Well, can probably imagine that the problem with that is it is, the assumption that everyone has capacity to work for free is really classist, and consequently can be have a bunch of other connotations to it. So those would be some examples around um, like unconscious derailment, like creating a hostile working environment, um, intentionally or unintentionally privileging particular groups without realizing that their identity has meaning. Um, and that we might think we're making neutral decisions when in reality they're not at all neutral. Any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Um, First of all, thank you for having this talk today. This has been really insightful. Um, so I am actually going to be like stepping into leadership at my organization. So what advice do you have for maybe newer leaders at an organization to be mindful of these things, and also like maybe advice for this might be helpful to other people on the call as well. But just creating that culture within like your team of inclusivity.
Yeah. I would say one of the best areas you have to make change is with decision making. And so consistently asking yourself, um, before you make a decision, who might be unduly burdened by this decision? Who might be unduly benefited from this decision? And have I considered folks with varying identities? Like, how might this impact women, parents, people of color, non-binary folks, right? Constantly asking that and checking in with who has my ear the most. When we're hiring people, promoting people, for example, am I promoting someone because I like them, I enjoy their company, or am I promoting them because they would be truly the best person for the job? Like, how do I know that they're the best person for the role? Um, I'll share this that when it comes to feedback, women in particular receive substantially more personality-based feedback. And they're oftentimes, for example, punished not just by men, but by other women for not upholding the stereotypical assumptions of how women should be, right? Agreeable, soft-spoken, um, extroverted, right? And so, which is another thing, speaking of extroversion, so often we privilege extroverted folks and we think that those are great leaders, when in reality they're just maybe charming, right? Which is nothing wrong with being charming, but where it becomes problematic is when we misconstrue that charmingness for being good at their job, right? And we penalize folks who might be more introverted for not being extroverted, and we don't promote them to positions. The next is to think about, how am I developing my team members? Am I constantly pushing into the forefront the one or two staff who I already perceive to be good at public speaking? Well, if I'm doing that, that's going to be the group that will, or the person who will get to develop that skill more. Can I approach this more equitably? Can I have a growth mindset about my team members and challenge them to do things that maybe they're not super comfortable with yet, but that they could develop a skill using the example of public speaking, right? More often. How I do this in my own organization is when we have, newscasters who want to cover our students in the at the work sites. I will tell them that you're probably not going to get like our most well-spoken student, because we are on a rotating basis. Everyone gets the opportunity to talk about the work that they're doing, why they're doing it, right? What an invasive species is, et cetera. Um, and we find that the more that they know this is coming, and we can prepare them for that as well, but the more confidence they have, and the more the team members end up having a growth mindset. So, again, to recap, um, having an equity lens of how you make decisions is going to be your best tool. Making sure that those who are going to be impacted by the decision are a part of the decision making process, and inviting constructive dissent, right? Asking your team members, this is my idea. Why might this fail? And making it safe for folks to tell you why it might fail so that you can solve for those potential failures ahead of time rather than reactively.
Really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Anyone else? All right. Well, friends, if there are no other questions for today, I'll go ahead and wrap up. But again, please do stay in touch. If you think of any other questions later on, you can always reach me at august@creamcityconservation.org. Everyone will get a recording of today as well as a handout. And I hope you'll join us next week, Wednesday, same time, same place, for Camila Montenegro's presentation on how to create more equitable and inclusive practices for queer staff of color in the outdoor field. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great week. See you all next time.